All
So,
right, we're live.
so I wanted to give this presentation on medical affairs that would allow everyone here to kind of understand what it is that medical affairs does. I think in the course of my many number of years in pharmaceuticals, I never really understood what medical affairs did until I actually worked for them, because it's not it's not something that by the name itself you really get. You really understand, like, regulatory affairs. Okay, they manage the regulatory aspects of the drug product. You've got research and development that does R&D, which is a lot of scientific stuff that has to go on with around the drug product or active ingredient. And then you have medical affairs, which is kind of the stepchild of the pharmaceutical development process, only because they really, in many cases, and at least in very mature pharmaceutical companies, they really get involved in the drug product towards the end of the development life cycle. And so I really wanted to help people understand what it is that they do, so that they could get a good idea, so that when when you speak with somebody in medical affairs, you can really understand what their function is, what their scope is, what they do, and how they do it. So so in this presentation, I'm going to be going over scope, the various functional groups, look at the value chain analysis as to where they provide the most value in terms of the drug development life cycle, the functional relationship, how they manage external relations, tools of the trade, and data context flow for around the systems that they do manage. So what's the core focus of medical affairs? If I had to put I listed like the top four things that they do, right? It's facilitate the good science and safety of the drug product, right? That's key to what they do, all right? If you get nothing from this presentation, get that, because when you're developing and you're implementing a new drug, just because you have a sales force that could sell snow to an Eskimo, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to sell drug product to an HCP, because a lot of doctors out there, when they prescribe the medicine to the patient, they are actually putting their license on the line, and there's a level of comfort that they need to have about a drug that can only be discussed on scientific terms in order for them to feel comfortable about prescribing it, especially with new medications out there. This becomes key to getting that drug on the market to the patients and helping the patients out, right? They also manage the late-stage clinical support of clinical trials from phase 3 to phase 4 studies, because if you think about it, as a drug, once a drug goes into phase 3 and you get approval sometime within the phase 3, phase 4 time frame, if all goes well, once you're starting those late stage studies, it's really doing a lot of very fine adjustments of the clinical studies for various indications or various safety points, responding back to FDA inquiries. And so the people in medical affairs are usually responsible for that, because they're the ones, they're either the doctors, the nurses, the physician's assistants, and the PharmDs that really can talk the language and understand the science, the medical science behind what it is that the company is trying to put on the market. And so they have to be key in terms of managing what studies that they're going to be managing. So they manage the drug product expanded access for end of clinical trial access, or for countries where product is not going to be registered, at least not for the time being. And what that helps is, so let's say you have a drug that you could be you're not going to commercialize the drug in every market. There's some markets that'll come first, and some markets that may come later on as you successfully market that drug in the major markets, right? And so a lot of times medical affairs will create these expanded access programs in specific countries to allow, to help patients with their illnesses, right? As well as to really test out the market in that area, especially in the rare disease space where the drugs can be very expensive and they don't know what the population, they may not be aware of the population of people that may be suffering from a typical illness. The other thing that they do is they facilitate the request for non-registrational studies, which is also a very important piece of medical affairs. When you have a drug that's either in the process of being approved or has already been approved, a lot of times there are questions that come back either from the regulatory agencies, or you see certain indications that there could be safety issues. A lot of times you'll have professors or academicians or people from other research institutes that may want to, conduct either clinical studies or research studies on your product. And what they'll do is the pharmaceutical companies or biotechs will establish mechanisms for them to apply for doing what is called non-registrational studies. And a lot of times, if these studies are for an indication that that the pharmaceutical company may not have been aware of, they may support these studies, right? They may say, okay, you can use our drug. We give you permission to use our drug for this study. It's something we haven't considered. And there are times when that study can go from, if there's positive results in a specific clinical indication, they may turn that non-registrational study into a registrational study, depending upon the cost-benefit analysis, of course. Then they also do their secondary focus is around product advisement for clinical leads in early stage of development. We'll get into that a little bit. Facilitate clinical site selection and initiation with the clinical development folks, as well as they get involved in health economics outcomes research, as well as patient services. So what are the different areas that, if I could split up all the functions that medical affairs does, I would segregate them into medical communications and operations, medical information services, medical strategy, and the MSL organization. So medical communication and operations, and remember, what their primary focus is the exchange of scientific and safety information between the pharmaceutical company and the external HCP environment, as well as insurers and payers, right? So with that, they'll be facilitating publications of their drugs. They'll be conducting, investigator-sponsored research. They'll be managing medical education. Certain treatments require not only that their internal medical folks are appropriately trained, but the HCPs out there are medically trained in the event that there are some, that could be serious adverse events associated with that drug product, or contraindications for taking other drugs or anything of that sort. Then they're also responsible for grants management. Medical information services is another key area that they're responsible for, and that's what medical information services is responsible for the collection and comments of everything to do with the drug product, right? So every time a physician may have a question or comment or any of anything in scientifically related to that drug, or even non-scientifically related to that drug, they could actually call on the medical information services for that particular company to ask them, does this drug, or they can share with them maybe a serious adverse event, which is also a part of the intake process for PD for any SAEs through the medical information services. And what they do is they'll tend to, when they start gathering these questions and comments by country, by city, country, region, location, they'll also report on that information so that people know, well, what do people understand about our product? How do they feel about our product? What can we do to improve it? Is everything going well? Especially during a launch period where there could be more questions than there are answers in terms of the efficacious use and management of that product to the external community. Likewise, they're also involved, obviously from the name, medical strategy with managing the brand teams, the expanded access teams, health economics outcomes research, project management office, disease teams, which go hand in hand with the brand teams. The difference is that the brand teams will work on managing everything from a brand perspective of that product, whereas disease teams focus specifically on the disease to understand what's going on with that disease and how are our drugs positioned to effectively manage that particular illness or disease. Then there's patient services, which many companies do have. And patient services can be both in medical affairs and commercial, right? But it's all about trying to help the patient get access to the drug product and ensure that they're taking the drug in a safe and efficacious manner. I've had a lot of interaction with patient services in terms of ensuring that that their system that they're operating in a manner consistent with the company requirements, and that they try to manage the patients in an appropriate manner. Anyway, then there's the medical science liaisons, which is an important component of any global medical affairs organization. What MSL and you'll see that their name is typically shortened to MSLs. What they do is they are the face of the company to the external HCP organization, to the external HCP organizations that are out there. So they're the ones that have to go out there, and provide a voice behind the drug products that are being used. Commercial organizations will often call on MSLs to really provide the science behind the drug products to the HCP. So in many cases, when a doctor has a question to the sales force that's of a scientific nature, and usually the sales force will not respond to it. They'll usually either type a question into their CRM program that'll kick off what is called a medical information request form to their medical information services organization, or they'll schedule a visit with an MSL so that they can kind of facilitate or explain the science to that doctor, nurse, or whoever it is has the question. Any questions in terms of this slide?
Is the project management office specific to medical strategy, or is that have to do with some of those boxes have to do with brand teams, and expanded access is also commercial? So is that project management office specific to
their PMO is specific to the generation, is to the management of content that needs to be created to support the brand teams as well as the disease teams, in addition to ensuring that whatever content is created for specific events. Like there could be North American medical congresses that they go to. ASCO, right? That's a huge one from an oncology perspective. Just like there's in Vertex there was the the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation conferences that happen on an annual basis. Those things are gold for medical affairs because that's where they go in there and present material that they've worked on for a number of months that's based on ISR data, publications, various data from clinical studies that needs to be collected and presented, at those meetings in order to make sure that, as they're developing this drug product, even after it's commercialized, that they're bringing the external HCPs along for the ride so they're aware of what's going on with their product. Does that answer your question? Any questions from the virtual audience?
Could you expand a little bit on HEOR and what that does?
I haven't been a lot involved in HEOR, but what it is the really understanding of what are the countries that we are currently doing business with, either from a commercial or R&D perspective, in order to understand the value around marketing and selling of products in those areas. There are certain countries where, even from a research perspective, if we show that we're having a positive outcome in those areas from either an R&D or commercial perspective, or for even from a non-registrational perspective, we can still get back some compensation for those countries. And they work with a lot of those folks. Work with the government agencies in order to get some, I would say, rebates or monies back to once they can positively show that they've had successful outcomes in those various regions. Like, for example, a lot of countries in Europe do that. Germany does that. I believe France has something set up where if you could show a positive outcome from a patient, whether the patient's been on the treatment or is taking a drug off label, you can get some type of compensation back from that country. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that was great. I mean, for Bluebird Bio, HEOR falls under market access. And the reason why I asked was exactly what you just mentioned, that it's based on outcome. And they manage that, valuation of the drug itself is based on the outcome and not, and so that's exactly where HEOR is very helpful, I guess.
Yeah, and HEOR can be either in it's one of those groups where it kind of falls on a line between commercial and R&D.
Right.
Sometimes in some pharmaceutical companies you'll see them in R&D. Some pharmaceutical companies you'll see them in commercial. It depends on where they want to position that particular functional organization. Even in and I was even surprised by this. There's a certain number of, I would say, medical affairs like groups at other companies where they fall mostly on a commercial side and less on the R&D side, which is surprising. But it depends on the perspective of the company and how the organization was created. So this next slide shows the value creation of the R&D development chain, right? So there are a number of steps that there are a number of steps that an R&D organization takes in order to manufacture a drug, right, or to get a drug to market. You have to have a need. You do research on that particular disease and drug. You develop that drug. You manufacture it. It gets produced, prescribed, and managed, right? So and then underlying that is all the number of steps around, how that actually happens, right? Understanding the market need, developing the enterprise strategy, understanding the disease, and for the most part, right, medical affairs is really focused on managing is really, they provide value under the the management of that product life cycle, right? The medical strategy, the medical communications and operations, medical science liaisons, medical information services are all poised to provide value, or the greatest value, towards the end of the life cycle. Now that said, for a lot of companies that are really in the early stages of the drug development process, right, for their drug products, what you will find is that they will often take their medical affairs organization and have them act as product advisors for the entire drug discovery and development chain process. This helps them because they don't want to, as you get closer to commercializing a drug product, right? You just don't want to hire MSLs that know nothing as to how that drug was developed or what the research was involved. You want to be able to bring these people on at least a core bunch of people on a little bit early to really provide their expertise on the knowledge of the drug, the research of the drug, in order so that when that drug is finally commercialized, you could then focus them on managing the product life cycle as if towards the end of managing the product life cycle towards the end of its value chain. I hope that makes sense. Any questions? Okay, I think that's good.
Oh, it's very good. No, excellent. Please keep going.
So global medical affairs is a true in many companies, unless you are a U.S. only pharmaceutical company, which I haven't run across too many of those. Global medical affairs will be operating in any country you're looking to manage your drug product in, right? If you'll have them spread across the U.S. You'll have them in the EU, of course. You may have an international headquarters for medical affairs in the EU, positioned in a country that you typically do business with, whether it's Switzerland or the UK or France or wherever the area may be. You will definitely have an office in the South Pacific, and you'll have, for those regions where you may not have, where it may be a little bit remote, let's say you have a drug that you're commercializing in Saudi Arabia. Well, you'll typically have a country medical doctor that will represent medical affairs in Saudi Arabia that will report into your international headquarters. As well as, if you have somebody, if you're looking to commercialize in India or in South Africa, it would be the same thing. All those countries would have a country medical director to represent medical affairs in those countries where you're doing business. And likewise, you will have medical science liaisons composed of some doctors and some PharmDs that will report into those country medical doctors that will roll up into the International Medical Affairs Organization. And really, you're in a small to medium-sized company, the functional landscape of that organization will be, you may have medical strategy that will report into the CMO or a high executive for for your biotech company. You'll have which medical strategy will cover, mostly will be mostly a North American centric organization. You'll have an international medical affairs organization where it will be composed of your international medical affairs lead, which may have a number of countries reporting into it, contingent on where you're doing business. Then you'll have a U.S. Or North American medical affairs specific only area that'll be both strategic and operational, supporting the medical science liaisons in North America, including Canada as well. Although Canada is more aligned, I think, in some of their regulatory aspects to Europe, they would still follow, the North America. They would still fall under, typically a North American organization, contingent on the size of the company. Then you would have the medical communications and operations organization that will also be responsible, will also report in the CMO, and they're responsible for managing all the tools and technologies that go into supporting medical affairs, to distributing those technologies to the organizations that they work with. They'll have, a medical legal review system. They'll have a medical information system, a publications management, grants management, key opinion leaders system, learning management system. They may even have systems like Smartsheets working with them. They'll share many of these systems, depending upon the size of the company, will be shared with their international colleagues as well. And some of these functions in medical communications and operations will either be duplicated by the International Medical Affairs Organization as a jointly owned but separate system, or will be shared by medical communications and operations, depending upon the size of the organization and the cost and the complexity, basically. Any questions on this slide? So how does the medical affairs manage their external relationships? Well, they have to be able to, understand the evolving and changing roles of HCPs. They have to really know their clients in order to try to make time on their busy calendars to help them understand the medication that they're prescribing to their patients. They have to be able to do that. They have to be able to establish relationships, work with insurance companies, payers, state Medicaid offices, Medicare offices, in order to ensure that, our drugs are being adequately represented out there. They need to, ensure that, that if there's any social media websites that the company's participating on, they have to be able to look at those sites and understand what's going on and who's saying what about the drug and how they have to respond in a scientific manner. So it's really about managing the perception, not only the science, but the perception of what's going on at the company in order to best support the communication and science of that organization.
Can you expand a little bit on what do you mean by the changing customer roles?
Well, a lot of times, the changing customer roles. I mean, there's a lot of, over the course of the last 20 years, some of the roles of physicians have changed, right? In terms of, the changing roles of nurses and what it is that they're doing and how they're working. It used to be that, physicians at one time or another, many years ago, they used to go in and maybe they'd have a pad of paper on them and they would take notes on a pad of paper and maybe, scribe those notes into some sort of, system later on. Nowadays, you go into a physician's office, right? And everything is done either on an iPad or a laptop or some sort of device. And how do they how they have to understand they have to be able to understand how to best communicate with those physicians and nurse practitioners and nurses and PAs and all the folks in there, and what are their roles in terms of the organization that they're in, and whether they're changing in their roles, and in order to be as effective as they can to represent the company. So that's basically what that means. So some of the top tools, scientific tools that the medical affairs use are, customer relationship management systems, medical information systems, medical information reporting systems, legal review and digital asset management systems, mobile technologies. These are some of the top systems that you will find in any, I would say not the top, but I would say the most used or the most utilized of all of the tools that they use. But the other systems are just as important. And quite frankly, I've never seen a company of small to medium size not use any of these systems to one capacity or another in the organizations that I've been in. So a CRM, what a customer relationship management system is basically, you could call it what we used to call back in college the black book of physicians, right? It identifies all their physicians that they're responsible for. It may have their, where they got their medical degree from, what publications that they're working on, who they've met with. Either that's from somebody from your corporate organization or your sales organization. But some of this information they may not be able to access, because a lot of times the medical personnel cannot see what the commercials people are talking about to the physician and vice versa, because you have to have a segregation between science and sales, especially in the European countries where in many European countries, you can't even, Med-Affairs MSLs cannot even have a proactive visit with an HCP. It has to be reactive. They have to be called upon. They can't just walk in or schedule an appointment with them without getting a fine by the Ministry of Health. The medical information system we talked about a little bit. That's a system that is used to collect questions and comments from the HCP back to the Medical Affairs HQ and provide a response to them. Many of the responses are often canned responses, right? But some, depending upon the question, have to be curated. They have to develop that response, because it may require some, scientific digging, or they may have to go out and figure out, well, what's the appropriate response for this question from because it could be anything. It could be any type of question that a doctor or researcher may have. Then there's medical information reporting, that if your medical information system doesn't have a report engine associated with it, then you're probably going to layer some sort of, reporting engine on top of that, whether it's Tableau or Oracle or whatever the reporting engine may be. You want to be able to dig into what it is that people are talking about your drug, what questions they have, where they're located, what comments they may have. And some companies even gather sentient analysis on their drug products to understand, are physicians, are nurses, is the medical community really happy about my drug products? Is it working with them? That's really trying to get at the heart of it from a scientific perspective, because again, at the end of the day, it's the doctor's license that's on the line when that patient takes your drug. It's not the pharmaceutical company's license. Well, at least not initially. So then there's the medical legal review system with a digital asset that's usually coupled with a digital asset management repository. For every piece of content that goes out to the external environment, it's got to be reviewed by a number of groups. It's got to be reviewed by, a number of medical people responsible. It's got to have legal review of that content. It's got to have regulatory review of that content, because if it doesn't meet whatever standards that they have from those three organizations, then it's not going out. It's very much controlled what they put out there. There's usually, at least three sets of eyes on any content that they put out there. Mobile technologies is very important because, if you have a person that's out on the field, you want them to have, you want them to be able to, travel as light as possible, have the latest information at their fingertips regarding your drug products, whether it's slide decks or medical information or anything that they may need to support that drug product out in the field by working with in working with their doctors and nurse practitioners that are out there. They have to have that information handy with them. And it becomes, I've worked with a lot of MSLs who've had, difficulties in, getting that information, technical difficulties. And it can be very frustrating for them if either a piece of equipment's too heavy, or they don't get Wi-Fi access, or it just leads to various complications. Okay.
Hey, David. I know we're very close to the end, but I do have a question. This is very interesting. I'm going to your core focus. You had mentioned that the medical affairs, the core focus is to facilitate the communication of science and safety of the drug product. Looking at the slide on the CRM, realizing there's a commercial organization as well, does medical affairs and commercial use the same CRM, or do they use different instances of these applications? They
use the same system, but the data is segregated, so neither one can view each other's data, because they usually say, oh, we put a firewall in. It's not a firewall. They think it's a firewall, but really the logic in the CRM is set up so that they can see that a visit happened by a salesperson or a medical person, but they can't see the content of what was discussed. Because the last thing you want to do, especially in Europe, is have a medical person act as a salesperson. That's a big no-no, and you can get fined a lot of money for doing that. And in the U.S., it's the same thing. You don't want a salesperson acting as a medical person, speaking scientific information, speaking of the science of that drug, because they could get into hot water, especially if it's a key opinion leader who may have a different opinion, and all of a sudden that person finds themselves in over their head very quickly.
Right. Great, thank you.
Okay, so I've put here, basically what I've done here is I took an old data flow context diagram just to show you all the interactions that these systems may have. You have with one another. Like you would have, let's say, at the very bottom, you would have data from your publication system that may go into your CRM system, so that, oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I left I was walking towards the screen because I really kind of give this, anyway, never mind. Okay. So this system shows you that many of their systems, in order for them to work as effectively as possible, they should be integrated together, whether it's their medical information system must, at times work with their medical legal review system in order to, develop and add content, right? Their CRM system, which is down here, must often work with their publication system, and so that when publications are completed, the MSL can, grab content through that system or through the medical legal review system. So, all of these systems must be integrated together, either technically or organizationally, in order for to position that medical affairs organization to work as reliably, and effectively as possible. And likewise, all of these systems must be able to report out the information that medical affairs needs in order to evaluate the how effective that they're being out in the field with the doctors and nurses that they work with.
David, thank you very much. This has been really, really interesting. Really appreciate it. Also appreciate everyone who's joined us, and I hope everyone has enjoyed the session and has a great day. Thank you.